it all. There we go. As they come in. Great. Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Still allowing some folks in, but just to remind everyone, welcome to the Islamic Courses session titled Book Review Discussion, Empire of Difference, Why Did the Ottoman Empire Last So Long? We're very privileged and honored to have Professor Karen Barkey from the University of California, Berkeley at the US of A, and it's hosted by Dr. Yakoob Ahmed from the Young Ottomans Foundation. theyoungottomans.com. Just for security reasons, please display your full name and device on entry. Just some housekeeping rules. Please keep your phones or devices on mute. It is being recorded. If you're not registered, just leave your email address to receive a recorded copy of the session. And there is a Q&A session, and you'll be able to ask the professor directly or on chat. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Yakoob. Over to you. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Oh, excellent. Okay, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. And especially thank you very much to our guest, Professor Karen Barkey, who was very prompt and very generous in taking our invitation on board and giving us this presentation. Now, I myself, as an Ottoman historian, have found Professor Karen Barkey's work very interesting in the sense of the way that empire is understood as Ottoman historians, and in how empire is understood by and large by Muslims in regards to colonialism and so forth. And so it was very interesting to see this notion of how the idea of empire of tolerance and empire of difference was presented in that sense, especially for those of us who have been raised, some of us who have been raised in England and the United Kingdom. We've had a particular feeling or a sense of what you could call a residual empire in some ways. Some people who are raised in the United States of America might make the impression of a loosely attachment to the notion of empire of different peoples, of a cosmopolitan space. But a lot of people who have been raised in a nation state are quite alien and detached from what it means in regards to this concept of empire. And so, Professor Karen Barkey, I wanted to ask you initially this idea, when you talk about the notion of empire of tolerance and difference, how is that different than the perception of the nation state in some ways? And what are your opinions and ideas on that?
Okay. Well, first, let me thank Mizan al-Mulk and you, Dr. Yakoob Ahmed, for inviting me and making me part of this discussion and this group. So I'm very honored to be with you and to discuss the particularities of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the concept of empire more generally. So first of all, I just want to say that I really make a difference, a separation between not only the modern contiguous empires of the sort of the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg, the Roman Empire, all of those early empires that were contiguous in their territories, that were very large empires and did not have the means and technology of controlling and managing society in the ways that we know today. And I make the distinction between them and colonial empires, which I think were a different sort of empire. And also I make the distinction with nation states. So I want to say we don't have with the nation state this long example of a nation state. We don't know yet what it will turn out to be, because we've had a very short, this is, most of the nation states are really, especially the post-colonial ones, are 1940s and 50s and after. So that's a very short time. And that's what really got me interested in this issue of longevity, is the number of years, the number of decades, the number of centuries that these empires were managing history, population, populations, diversity, for lands that were so far away from each other. How did they do it, and how did they manage it for so long? And I think there's a secret there that is different from the colonial empire and also different from the nation state. One of the secrets, I think, is this organizational mode, what I call the hub and spoke model, that actually the imperial center had relationships with the periphery, with each group in the periphery that were different than the other. So if you think of the way in which empires, these old empires, accumulated land, they made war, and they took a territory and they included it into the empire. As they included it, they looked at what was on the ground as the social structure, the people, the cultures, and included them with a particular deal, with a particular negotiation. So what you have is patchwork that keeps together by a larger ideal of empire, and in the ones we're talking about, especially for the Ottoman, of being, an universal representation of an Islamic empire, which keeps it together and also differentiates it from its neighbors. And internally, you have, these groups, these lands, these different territories that are attached to the center by particular deals. And this differentiates the empire from the nation state. The nation state is an entity, first of all, that is usually much smaller geographically, that claims to be homogeneous, that claims that everyone has the same history and the same culture. And if you don't, and you are part of it, they try to assimilate you to make you into the same.
Right.
Okay, so the nation state wants to impose sameness, and the empires that I talk about, they want to let difference exist, because on the one hand, they know they cannot, in this vastness of territory, they know they cannot make everybody the same. They cannot expel everybody. They cannot, they don't, in a sense, they also don't have a choice, but they're very interested in this kind of live and let live attitude of, okay, we'll gather the taxes, we'll make sure that different people flourish in their territory, and we will benefit from that. And that's what I thought was the most interesting feature. And I'll let you ask a question, but I want to
no, please continue. This is all about
okay.
you.
I want to just say one of the most wonderful, stories about Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, when his counselors come to see him and they say, we should expel the Jews out of the empire because some of them are usurers. And Sultan Suleiman points to this vase on his desk, and he says to his counselors, look at the vase. It has flowers of many colors, of many sizes and shapes. And my empire has Turks, has Moors, has Greeks, has Jews, has all kinds of people of different characteristics, traits, and they have benefits as well. They give us certain benefits. And what we need to do is allow them to all live in peace and benefit from the peace that we will create in our empire. And that became really the story that was normative afterwards. Pluralism, maybe at the very beginning, was something that they had to deal with. They were conquering places that were different than them. They didn't have that much the numbers. They were warriors who came to foreign territories, so they might have had a demographic disadvantage.
Right.
But this story of including people and showing accommodation, which they called istimalet, that word that they used for accommodation, became the way in which the empire dealt with this notion of diversity. And I think that's very different than colonial empires that wanted to civilize supposedly everybody, or that the nation state that wants to make everyone the same.
Right. And leading on from this, then, it's the notion of, growing up, I've always been raised around the notion of identity, that identity is important, identity matters, and so forth. And yet here in this part of Ottoman history, what I'm getting prior to the 19th century, I'm assuming, identity seems to be quite loose. What is an Ottoman identity prior to the 19th century Reformation, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I don't even think that we can talk about identity in this modern way in the Ottoman Empire. So what were people attached to? That's how we should think about it. They were attached to the village, to the land, to the environment in which they lived, to that niche that produced the food and the kind of sustainability for them. They were attached to the local. And then they were attached to their religion.
Right.
Because at the local, for Christians, they had the low-level prelates and the low-level religious leaders, and then a hierarchy that went up to the highest levels. And for Muslims, they had, on the one hand, maybe a mosque, not everywhere, but they had a Sufi, either a Sufi leader, a sheikh, and a local convent, or around the sheikh, a zawiyah, or they had a mosque with a preacher. So they had local attachments, but they also knew, I think, very much through this concept of justice, adalet, that there was a system, the judge, the qadi, which distributed a just judgment. So that was very important. In fact, in my first book, I start one of the chapters with the story of a peasant who keeps getting taxed by multiple landlords who keep claiming that they are his landlord. Right. And he walks with his donkey. He walks for 3-4 days to come to the center of the region where there is the qadi, to complain to the qadi that there are too many people exacting taxes, and that should be told to the sultan, so that the sultan can make this just. So I think identity in the Ottoman Empire was both very local, and it also linked to a system, to an understanding of justice. Sorry, I forgot to turn off my phone. So that's, I think, how we have to understand this notion that you will be attachments and you live within your locality, but there is somebody keeping an eye on you and keeping track of whether you will be taken care of or not. So that's how I don't think of it as a mobilized identity. It doesn't happen till much later, when nationalism, when ethnicity, all these things become real. They don't think that way. And that's why it's also easier to manage diversity. It's not mobilized,
Sure. Now, as a young Muslim growing up in the United Kingdom, I always had these tensions in regards to identity and fitting within the main framework of what it meant to be part of British society. And then as an Ottoman historian, for the first time in my life, I started to see a reverse of that, where we have an empire, which you can call, which is an Islamic empire, which Muslims are not necessarily the majority here, actually, where we can know that non-Muslims make up the majority of the empire, especially in the Balkans anyway. But whenever the discussions growing up when I was young about religion came across, there was a sense or an argumentation put forward that religion creates a sense of otherization, a differentiation, a sense of tensions and schisms between peoples and communities. And yet here in the Ottoman case, we have if we could call it that, the identity of the state was Islam to some degree. How has the state reconciled that with the multiplicities of peoples of different religious denominations, different types of Muslims as well, within this framework?
Okay, so I mean, there's a lot to unpack in here. This is a big question you asked me.
All right.
So let's start with in a sense, the fact that Islamic empires for all of their times, and not just the Ottoman, but the Fatimid or the Umayyads, or they all accepted the Pact of Umar as a way of organizing and understanding non-Muslims in a Muslim polity. Right. So that's the beginning. In a sense, that is the blueprint. There is an arrangement between non-Muslim communities and the Muslim ruler. And that arrangement says, as long as you pay the jizya, the tax for non-Muslims, as long as you accept, second subject status, I won't say citizen because they're not citizens, you will be protected by the state and you will be allowed to have cultural, religious autonomy. Right. And we will accept this. We will accept difference within the empire. Mm-hmm. And actually, the code of Umar, or the Pact of Umar, really was something, a blueprint that served these empires well. Because again, there was no concept of identity, of fighting across religious. I mean, no doubt there was discontent and there was, struggles from time to time. But what these empires were able to do is, how do you say in English, nip the discontent in the bud. Mm-hmm. Try to erase it at the very beginning, not let it ratchet up. Right. If they saw that there was, a struggle between Christians and Jews or Muslims and Christians, they interfered quickly to stop it. Mm-hmm. And that was part of the understanding of letting communities live within their set up lives, their boundaries, and letting them be okay. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, there is the Pact of Umar, okay? Right. On the other hand, I think the fact that there is diversity also within Islam, and there is diversity within the law in the Ottoman Empire, that is very powerful to create a sense that things are not just monocausal or monodirectional, that there are options. The success of these empires, I think, is the fact that there were alternatives. Right. So Ottomans accepted, and in fact, if you go back to the original emergence of the empire, the fact that Sufi sheikhs were at the forefront of the struggles, and they were the warriors who spread this Islam to the Balkans,
Right.
made them very much accepted in Islamic society, in Ottoman society.
Right.
So every sultan had a Sunni advisor, an imam, an ulema, and he had his personal Sufi advisor too. So that you know, how do you say, multiplicity already existed, and there were Sunnis and Shiite and Sufis. And the deal was that you were only seen as dangerous or fought against if you betrayed the state, if you allied with the Safavids, if you allied with another force. So that was the reason for in a sense, fighting against Sufis or Sunni community, Shiite communities.
Right.
So there is that diversity, which I think gives you a sense of the kind of separation already, but separation that is included. It's always separation, division that is included. Then there is the division in the law. So the Ottoman started with very light understandings of Islam. They didn't start with very strict Sharia law. What they were more knowledgeable on was the customary law that they brought from Central Asia, that they brought from the steppes of Central Asia, and the traditions that they lived by. So the Ottoman sultans, what they did is they put together these laws that were customary, traditional, from the land, etc., that they brought with them, and made them into a kind of secular kind of law, the Qanun. And Qanun was called Sultanic Law because it was the sultans who did them. And Sultan Suleiman finally codified them really and organized them to be the Sultanic laws that would be with every sultan repeated and accepted. On the other hand, you have Sharia. Sharia was seen by Ottomans as it was defined, a path, a way of life, a way of living a good life and an honorable life. And they saw that as such. And they also, however, put the two together, Sultanic and Sharia. They didn't make Sharia more powerful than Sultanic law, and they didn't make Sultanic law more powerful. And one of the earliest thinkers of this dichotomy, I want to read you what he says. If I can find it, just give me 1 second.
Take your time.
Okay, so Tursun Bey, who is one of the early intellectuals, scholars of the Ottoman Empire, religious scholar, and advisor to the Sultan, is thinking about both Sharia and Qanun. And he wants, in the 15th century, to explain the duality. So he says, and I quote from him, he says, government based on reason alone is called Sultanic Yasak. Yasak meant tradition and customary law. Government based on principles which ensure and the next is called divine policy or Sharia. The Prophet preached Sharia. but only the authority of a sovereign can institute these policies. Without a sovereign, man cannot live in harmony and may perish altogether. God has granted this authority to one person only, and that person, for the perpetuation of a good order, requires absolute obedience. So in this, you see exactly how Tursun Bey ties together the two and makes the Sultan the distributor of this justice. And that's why the concept of adalet, you know, I mean, this is one of the issues, no, in Islam and in the modern world today. We talk about justice and equality, etc., but justice is only one of them. In the Ottoman and the Islamic, adalet is so important. Justice is, and justice that is given by God, justice that is given by the Sultan, it's accepted. So that made, so I think putting the two in a similar plane and asking judges in the towns and in the cities to rule according both to customary Qanun and Sharia made them arbiters that were able to balance and decide for the good of the particular position. So I think that that was a key part of Ottoman success as well. Even Abu Suud Effendi, who was the Shaykhul Islam of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, even him, you know, he said we have to partly tamper with Sharia because we want our people in this condition to live really well. And if that means, he said, for example, that people are using, are having cash waqfs, which is not allowed in Islam, in the Sharia, that's okay because they are actually able to feed their families by having this. So he rationalized some of the particularities of Ottoman society and things that were happening by saying, you know, yes, Sharia says this, but we can change it a little bit to adapt to this situation. That was Abu Suud Effendi, and that's really, really important, I think. So now I forgot what question you had asked me, but the way in which both the Sultan, the ruling elite, and the ulema and the Shaykhul Islam were able to be a little bit more pragmatic, a little bit more flexible, and see that as a way of coexistence, that's really important to me. Okay. And it's a lesson for us. It's a lesson for modern world. It's flexibility, coexistence. It's understanding the other. You know, I think Gandhi said, no, I want to respect the other's religion really, really well, but the only way I can do it is by first being deeply religious myself. It's fine to be deeply religious. But the next step is also to be good to the other deeply religious person who is across from you. Or that kind of understanding was very much, I think, the key to the Ottoman success.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, I mean, one of the points I make is that I've always said that the Ottoman state is an emotional state, in the sense that it has a particular sensitivity of listening to the needs and the requirements of its society. And from what I'm understanding, from what you're saying that having a sense of a religious undercurrent facilitates that emotional understanding and sensitivity towards the people of the empire, because by and large, everybody of the empire has a particular religious denomination, and so there is something of commonality which binds it together. Exactly.
Is that a fair? Exactly.
Right?
It's being aware of your own deep religiosity,
Right.
but also being respectful of others' religiosity. And that was key. And, you know, it didn't start that way, I think. It started as a very pragmatic thing, you know, oh my God, there's all these people here. How do we manage it?
Right.
But then it became normative. And that's also the beauty of what we need to think about. Because when you respect the other,
Mhm.
and you feel respected by the other both ways,
Yeah.
you know, this is a successful thing, and you want to reproduce it because it's emotional, it's good, it feels good, you know. And can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Please.
Oh, okay. So that, I think, is a very positive story.
Right.
It becomes part of your understanding of how to be in life.
Right.
And I think that's what we need to strive for.
Now, in your book in particular, there's two interesting points. One is the 18th century, and you call it the long 18th century, which I guess is a play on to most academics who say the long 19th century.
19th century.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you wanted I'm assuming, make this case that the long 18th century, the long 17th century, the long 19th century, I mean, there's no real difference in terms of the stretch in that sense. But do you see a difference taking place in the 18th century? I definitely see in the 19th century, you start to write on the road out of empire. So I clearly see that the 19th century is a turning point for you. But how do you see the 18th century empire in your mind?
So the 18th century is actually, why do I call it the long one? And I stretch it, first of all, because I play with the different events that are happening at the beginning and at the end, etc. But more importantly, because that particular relation, you know, this kind of imperial hub and spoke relation, because that type of understanding of, you know, direction from the periphery to the state, and my relationship as a community is with the state, not with the other who is around me, in the sense that my ties, my benefits, my glory comes all from the state. That started to change.
Mm-hmm.
And the Ottoman Empire got, in a sense, networked in a different way.
Okay.
And it took a long time for those networks to develop. And that's why I call it, because, you know, you start associating with other groups, but they doesn't become, you start trading with others, you start taxing, the tax farm system, all of that created new ties. Mm-hmm. But until those ties change from just trading ties or taxing ties to more, as you say, emotional or cooperative or let's ally together type of ties, it takes a long time.
Right.
You
and
see.
So you feel that the 18th century is a turning point in that sense?
18th century is the moment where things change. And you can also see that because it changes in many, many ways, you know. The Balkan communities start getting influenced by European ideas of sovereignty and this and that. They start rising up in ways, or understanding there is, you know, there is starting grumblings of difference being more important than what it is. It's already in the 18th century, it becomes much more powerful in the 19th century, but it's there, it's beginning. Also, the networks are changing, the people are associating differently. The state is losing territory and is losing its strength, which also necessarily impacts the legitimacy of the state, how it is seen. You know, it's, so think in terms of, for example, the Ottoman Sultan was the caliph.
Mhm.
Yet, really, until the end of the 18th, the early 19th century, they don't claim that as a big identity of the sultan,
Mhm.
because they have legitimacy, they're powerful. They
Right.
don't care as much. As their political power wanes, they start increasing their religious, spiritual caliphate identity and power, etc. So it's all these balances start shifting in the 18th century. But it's still an empire. It's
Right.
still tight, in the same way they're still, and it's still an empire in the 19th century that wants to reform itself to be more like what it thinks is the correct way.
Right. Now,
Because it's being pushed by the Europeans, because it's losing territory, because everybody is starting to mobilize,
and so just to follow up on then how you began, when you said that this was an empire of tolerance and this was an empire of coexistence, and it worked and people were interacting with the state. If something is working, why all of a sudden is there an agitation, especially in the Balkans, towards the center? You mentioned about the lack of legitimacy in terms of the losses of territory and so forth. But in many ways, there was something that was clearly working in your mind. And so why has that now arisen in the 18th century, where people are now thinking of independence or separatism or anything of that nature?
Well, part of it is the new ideologies that are emerging. They have an effect.
Right.
There's new writings that spread to the Balkans. And in fact, it's the Balkans first because they're the closest to the Europeans.
Yeah.
The Arab provinces get it later because they don't have that much direct contact and they are happier being part of the empire.
Right.
It's those issues of ideology that start creeping up, but also what happens in the 18th century, and that's part of my argument, is that the tax farmers who start creating these chains of networks of tax farming become very powerful.
Okay.
And power, what power does to people.
Right.
It actually, makes them worse, I think. And what it did is that whether they were Christian or Muslim, tax farmers who became really powerful, they started very much abusing the population, abusing the locals. And as a result, there was increasing discontent among the peasants who started listening to other sources, to their religious leaders, to others who started telling them, that this was unjust, unfair, that their landlords were, exacting too much resources. And the Ottoman state was not strong enough to come in and fix the situation in the best way possible. I think that was one of the big issues. They kind of let the, Tepedelan Ali Pasha or these create these, semi-little states.
And one of the interesting things I found about your book is that you started off with a narrative of Mahmud II dying, which is obviously 1838. And then the last chapter of your book is, as I mentioned before, like the sort of Ottoman shift away from empire. Do you feel that that period of Mahmud is a fundamental turning point in regards to empire? And why would you think that?
Because Mahmud was the first probably to seriously think about how to start creating institutions that were more formal, the military that was more formal, education that was more formal, and in a sense started believing that everyone should be going through a similar path. So that's why I think Mahmud is a transitional figure. He goes from, before him, we have this negotiated empire, and he wants to make it more of a la nation state, not yet, but something that is more systematized. And I think that's why I see him as a transitional figure, and the one who kind of responded to things, but wanted to make it more like Europe, more systemic, more similar.
Do you think that Mahmud had an alternative or another way out, depending on what's happening in the world around him?
I'm not sure he had many alternatives. I don't think he had. I think Mahmud was actually a good sultan. He acted to protect the empire as much as possible from the incursions from the outside world, from the Europeans, from the Austrians, from the Russians. I mean, things had changed quite a bit in terms of the international threats too. So he was a good sultan. It's not that I'm saying that he did things in a kind of crazy way or not a politically savvy way. He was politically savvy, but he did have to make compromises that changed what the empire was about, or started it on the route of changing. And I think that later on there were opportunities, to establish a more multi confessional state, and keeping that part of the empire more alive. But it didn't work, partly because once you have Abdulhamid and then the Young Turks, you have a much more rigid, on all levels, from religion to political policy to nationalism. Everything becomes really rigid. And I think that's the demise of the empire.
Right. And this is going to be my last question, and then we'll throw it to the Q&A for everyone here. So in the 19th century, we start to see this idea of Ottomanism, right, as an attempt to try to create a sort of like a supranational sort of like identity of peoples who belong to the empire, right? And one of the things I've always found interesting is that in the 19th century, you do read narratives of people of the diaspora. There are people who travel to the Americas, and there are people who travel to South America, and they might be outside of the Ottoman domains, but they still have an attachment to the Ottoman center. And I always found it interesting is, how does one differentiate, let's just say, an Ottoman community in New York to people in Yemen? And how do they identify as being part of, belonging to the Ottoman domains to some degree? Unless
the people who are Ottomans in New York?
Yeah, let's just say people who travel to the United States. There was a lot of movement in the 19th century of people venturing out. But Ottomanism as an idea still made them feel attached to a concept of home. And you see the emergence of the idea of Vatan and so forth. Do you think that do you think that that was a policy, or Ottomanism was a policy which was something that could fit with empire, or do you think that was contrary to the idea of empire?
No, Ottomanism was very much, I think, a policy that could have continued a way, a particular, if we, an intermediary option in a sense, not being completely a nation state and modernizing the empire, but keeping the supranational, ideals. And it didn't, I mean, we know that societies, we know Yugoslavia had multiple, it broke apart, but had multiple ethnic national groups within it. So Turkey could have started of the empire with all of its multiplicity.
Mhm.
But you have to look at the context, and you have to look at what they're thinking at the time.
Mhm.
And if you think about that, clearly, they were responding to international conditions,
Mhm.
and they were responding to the threat they thought the Armenians were going to create, and the threat that the Balkan peoples will create, and all these Muslim refugees were coming in. There are so many factors here that also made it impossible for them to see the various options and to, I think, weigh them. We can see it. And now that we understand the whole longevity of the empire, I say, I wish the Ottomanist ideal of this kind of multiple nationalities would have continued
Right.
into the empire.
Yeah.
I mean, into the Turkish Republic. It would have been a much better project to start with,
Mhm.
Yeah,
I mean, one of the things I've always found fascinating is after the collapse of the Ottomans, like when we look at the combustion of, say, a country like Syria today, people are still identifying as that nation with that nation state identity. They'll still say they're Syrians. But in the Ottoman case, you don't see much remnants of that. Once the empire collapses, you don't see people saying we're Ottomans or so forth. It's really intriguing that even until the end, there's a looseness in regards to the Ottoman identity.
Yeah, because there was such ideological, force put into Turkish nationalism. It became such a powerful, if we are not going to make it as the empire, if all of these different groups that belong to us are now rebelling and they don't like us anymore, then we will be Turkish nationalists, and we will have an identity of, a Turkish nation. So they discarded. And I think one of the issues in the, again, I like to look at people at the time period that they're making decisions. So it's hard. I don't blame Mahmoud, or I don't blame Atatürk the same way people blame Atatürk, because he had to save a chunk of the country and make it into a new nation. But he so powerfully rejected the Ottoman past because he wanted to say, we are now a new nation, and rebuild something completely. It was a project of modernity for him. So associating with the past would have been, in his mind, a mistake. I wish he had taken some of the things from the past and looked and said, this was good.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Barkey. I
Thank
know I've made you speak for an exceptional long time, and my apologies.
No, it's good. It got me all excited, so it's fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what we're going to do now is we're going to open the Q&A up to the audience that we have and see if there are any questions from the guests that are here. So Bizan, I'm going to throw this back open to you. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question?
Yeah, we've got some coming through the chat. So I think there's one from Sarah Connor, and there's some things coming through. I'll put it on chat first.
Okay.
I can't see. Oh, now I see the chat.
Okay, shall I just read it out? Okay, so the question is, was there a class system in the Ottoman lands like in Europe? And if the Ottomans had a class system, would they have lasted for 600 years?
So I don't think we can say there was a class system, but there was certainly multiple ways of separating communities. So first division was between the ruler and his people, the subjects. Then the next division was askeri, the people who were part of the ruling class and the military versus the subjects. So there was distinction along those lines. Then there was distinction along professions. Certainly there was a very pronounced guild system in the Ottoman Empire, yet the guild system didn't make again, it's part of the beauty of it is that the guild system didn't allow for both division and contact across divisions. It didn't separate the groups completely into this guild versus the other and struggles between them. It was a more fluid, in a sense, interactive process where everybody was in the bazaar, everybody was in the same space, and certain streets were certain guilds, and certain streets were the Jewish guild of that guild, or the Christian jewelry makers, or the Armenian ones, but they still interacted, traded, and worked together on a daily basis. So in fact, even though there were divisions, they were not strictly, this is not a caste society, this is not a class society. And I think it moves towards class over time because, again, in the 18th century, there's a class of tax farmers, there's a class of, and in each group, funnily, among the Jews, among the Armenians, among the Greeks, among the Muslims, there is starting differentiation, right, because people trade, people tax, people, and then there is class distinctions coming. But early Ottoman Empire is really not a class society.
We got a second question.
We got a question on the, so who want to ask? Mac. So Mac, I'm just going to unmute you.
What?
Dear Professor, thank you for such a wonderful lecture. I apologize, you can't see me. I have a weak internet connection. Okay. I would like to ask about the non-Muslims status in the Ottoman Devlet, because I see often in literature Ottomans are accused of discrimination based on the jizya tax. And I would like to ask if it's fair to apply the notion of discrimination to that time, because this nation seems to come from the nation-state paradigm. And did the non-Muslims back then consider jizya unfair, or were there other measures applied to say that non-Muslims were discriminated?
So this is a complicated question because it really varied a lot by area and by kind of region of the empire. So it's not that the word discrimination probably for the Ottoman Empire means something else than what we see as discrimination today in the modern world. There is no doubt that, non-Muslims had an additional burden in terms of the tax burden. And sometimes that tax burden became very significant and did, lead to communities suffering and having to pool resources and things like that. There is no doubt about that. I think what makes the empire, in a sense, different is that while there were these particular issues, the Pact of Umar says non-Muslims cannot build a house that is taller than the Muslim. They cannot ride horses. They cannot, there are all kinds of restrictions. And these restrictions are, in a sense, on paper, but the interesting part, or the clothing restrictions that Jews have to wear this or Christians have to wear that, these restrictions on a daily basis were not really expected. And that's what made the system, again, more fluid, more flexible. If a Jew wore a Muslim kalpak in his daily business trade because he felt that he would get a little bit more status by wearing something Islamic, he did it. And he wasn't sent to jail for it. you know, he maybe was fined a little bit. But do you see what I mean? There was a of these are not the important things of life. We can let these boundary things go. The taxes, they didn't let go. The taxes sometimes were really heavy taxes, and that we don't have a good measure of that because we haven't done a full accounting of the jizya through every part of the empire. Okay, but we also know that in the Ottoman Empire, if a Jew didn't like the ruling of his own community, he went to the Qadi, to the Muslim court to get a better ruling. So there, again, there is a little space there for you not to feel discriminated against. Do you see what I'm trying to argue? The financial burden was real. We cannot really discuss that. Whether it was seen by people as discrimination, I'm not sure, because that language didn't exist. Did they complain about it? Yes, they did complain about it. There are lots of, examples of community leaders who ask state leadership to change that, to lower the taxes. However, the fact that there were multiple ways of comparing multiple in a sense, sources of alternative claim making made the empire less discriminatory. And I want to add also that the language sometimes was quite discriminatory. The way the official language might have referred to non-Muslims could be discriminatory because they used, language from texts that were Islamic texts, and they used, separation that way. But the practice of Ottoman state towards non-Muslim was not a discrimination the way we talk about it today.
Thank you. We have another question from Khalid. He's asking, it's mainly based around the millet system, but the main crux of the argument is similar to the question before, that were non-Muslims able to raise into higher positions of authority, or were there any restrictions placed on them in that context?
So non-Muslims through the Devshirme system, the Devshirme system was the levy of young boys from the Balkans that got educated, that got converted to Islam, then educated either in martial arts and the military, or in administrative and education, kind of literary education. Those groups became, even members of those groups, I should say, became grand viziers. They became important pashas in the administration of the empire. They were relied on, but they had become Muslim through the process of conversion in the Devshirme system. Originally, when Mehmed II conquered Constantinople and turned it into Istanbul, he relied on a lot of Byzantine Greek, political savvy people, administrators, and he pulled them into the Ottoman administration. Those, for example, didn't convert. Those were people who, they had skills and they understood, that they needed the past rulers or the knowledge of the land and the administration in order to rule better. I always make this, comparison with the Americans who went to Iraq, and the first thing they did was get rid of all of the educated and the state people, the de-Baathification, as we call it now, of Iraq. And with that, they actually lost all of the talent and all of the people who knew how to rule, how to administer Iraq, and they created chaos. So part of Ottomans were smarter than that. They were wily. They understood that they needed to keep foreign talent. And that's part also of inclusion. Not everybody was converted.
Do you have time for us to kick on? There are 2 more questions, or we can, is that okay? Sure. Okay, thank you. So one of the question is from Oriel Cooney. He's asking, his question is more related to how did the lack of resistance to industrialization affect the flow of nationalism and related ideas?
Wait. The lack of
resistance to industrialization affect the flow of nationalism and related ideas.
Can the person explain that a little better? I don't know what the relationship is.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your talk. It was an amazing talk. Now, there is this idea that in the 18th and 19th century, the Ottomans or certain strata of the society were against industrialization. So while the Europeans came with the European ideas of nationalism or romanticism, came within the prospect of industrialization. So did this resistance or Ottoman resistance or Ottoman lack of industrialization facilitate the flow of nationalist ideas into the Balkans specifically? And this is the question actually.
Yeah, I'm not really convinced that those two are causally tightly linked. I think that the Ottoman Empire resisted for a while to against industrialization, but again, starting with Mahmud II, you have already the beginnings of it. You have the empire adapting to the Western and starting to understand and getting advisors from Europe to tell them what would be the next steps for them to industrialize or modernize. So the ideas of nationalism certainly entered the empire initially through the Balkans, but they entered through, the traders and the merchants who were going from the Balkans and Balkan ports to Europe to trade. And it came through a different, in a sense, channel. But certainly nationalism became a strong force parallel to the time that the empire was struggling with how to industrialize, how much to industrialize, what it meant, where to begin, and this kind of competitive, will it help more in warfare? Would it help more in, administrative context in the empire? So that was a struggle that was parallel to the entry. I wouldn't say they were exactly connected. At least that's how I see it.
Thank you. And
we have a hand raised from Ashik Akram. Just
okay.
Hello, it was a very interesting talk. My question is regarding this concept of religious tolerance in Ottoman Empire. In Mughal India, for example, the caste system was made intact. So the Mughal didn't interfere with the existing caste system of India, and the social evils that was associated with Hinduism per se was not purified by even Aurangzeb. So even Aurangzeb didn't liberate the lower caste, for example. So in Turkey, was there a kind of social structure, discriminatory social structure present, and did Ottoman do anything with that? How was the social structure was in pre-Ottoman era, and how did Ottoman change it? Was there something similar?
No, actually, there isn't anything similar to a caste, lower caste. I mean, what there is, you know, what the Ottomans conquer and what they make into the empire is basically various iterations and structures of peasant societies. And a lot of the peasant societies or peasant regions that they actually take over from the Byzantine Empire are quite poor, and certainly their poverty and their exploitation by the Byzantine landlords was one of the reasons why the move to the Ottoman was easier than what expected. Byzantine, Byzantinists write about that Byzantine society was so impoverished by the time that the Ottomans started their conquest into Western Anatolia and then into the Balkans, that some of this acceptance of Ottoman rule was the fact that they thought they would have a better life under Ottoman rule. And that became true, that became correct. Life conditions did improve, and that we have a lot of historical sources on that. But there was no big class system, as I said before. The peasants were the subjects of the empire, like the traders, like the petty traders. They were all subjects, and that put them in a big bag all together. They didn't differentiate a lot between them. What they differentiated on was their ability to pay taxes, and that created some difference. But that's not India at all.
Okay, I think we're going to close it there. I don't want to take up too much of your time, Professor Barkey. Hojam, thank you very much for giving us so much of your time. And
it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
And let me know of your future events, please, so that I can hear about that too.
We will do. So I just want to say thank you very much for everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here, and thank you very much for your questions and your patience and your diligence for sticking around. We will keep you up to date with the next set of Ottoman studies talks that we will do. Thank you very much for everyone. Professor Barkey, if you can just stick around for a few minutes after everyone leaves, and then you and I can have a chat.
Okay.
So thank you very much, everyone, and take care of yourselves.
Thank you very much, everyone. We'll be sending
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
We'll be sending the link for the recording as well. Thank you. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.